Hi everyone, welcome to Rural Socioeconomic Development Week 3. This week we will be discussing the theme of sustainable development and outcome 3 of your report. Okay everyone, the top-down policies that we'll be looking at this week are the EU Rural Development Policy, the Scotland Rural Development Policy, the Land Reform Act, Local Authority Planning, and the EU Rural Development Programme. So a top-down approach is where an executive decision maker or another top organization makes the decisions of how something should be done, and then this approach is disseminated under their authority to lower levels in the hierarchy. And those lower levels are to a greater or lesser extent bound by the decisions made above them. So let's start with the EU Rural Development Policy. The aims are to achieve the following strategic objectives. It wants to foster the competitiveness of agriculture, ensure the sustainable management of natural resources and climate action, and achieve a balanced territorial development of rural economies and communities, including the creation and maintenance of employment. So this is closely tied to the Common Agricultural Policy, which is the first pillar. The EU Rural Development Policy is often called or is referred to as Pillar 2, and this comprises all of the top-down and bottom-up approaches of rural programs and policies that we'll be looking at today. Okay, so here we have the policy priorities and some ways that they are implemented of EU Rural Development Policy. These complement the outcomes on the previous page, and so to get more information about what these are and how they're supposed to work, you should see the priority summaries of the EU Rural Development Policy. They provide a lot of aggregated information on the expected achievements and results, and also planned targets and interventions of how to achieve those targets. And so these six policy priorities are further elaborated through 18 specific areas of intervention. And you can see these also in that each state has their own rural policy in the EU region, and these rural development programs in each EU member states are documents drawn up by countries and regions that set out strategic approaches and actions to meet the needs of the specific geographical area that they cover, and they incorporate the outcomes on the previous page and also the priorities on this page. So their main goal is to, at the regional and local level, make sure that they implement all of these, and then funding and grants can occur. So here's an infographic showing how Scottish rural development has supported the rural economy in Scotland so far. The Scotland Rural Development Programme 2014 to 2020 delivers Pillar 2 of the EU Common Agricultural Policy, which means it funds economic, environmental, and social measures for the benefit of rural Scotland. And the main purpose of the current incarnation of 2014 to 2020 is to help achieve sustainable economic growth. So it focuses a lot on the socio and environmental components of economic growth. So the main priorities are enhancing the rural economy, supporting agricultural and forestry businesses, protecting and improving the natural environment, addressing the impact of climate change, and supporting rural communities. And there's about 13 different schemes addressing sustainable economic growth. And we can really see how the Scottish Rural Development Programme is a subset of the kind of EU Rural Development Programme scheme. The Land Reform Act of 2003 includes three main provisions. One, the first part of the Act codifies into Scots law the right to universal access to land in Scotland. Specifically, it establishes a right to be on land for recreational, educational, and certain other purposes, and a right to cross land. Those rights only exist if they are exercised responsibly, and that's stated in the Outdoor Access Code. The second part establishes community right to buy, allowing communities of populations of up to 10,000 to register an interest in the land, entitling them to first right of refusal should the owner put the land up for sale or intend to transfer ownership, as long as a representative community body can be formed to carry out the process. And the third part allows the crofting community right to buy, which allows crofting communities to purchase crofts and associated land from existing landowners. And it differs from the community right to buy in that it can be exercised at any time, regardless of whether the land has been put on the market. And that allows crofting communities to purchase land even in the absence of a willing seller. The 2016 Act grants Scottish ministers the power to force the sale of private lands to community bodies to further sustainable development in the absence of a willing seller. So these are key top-down policies to look at when you're writing outcome 2 of your report. So local planning authorities are responsible for administering 3 main parts of the planning system. Development planning, setting out how places should change in the future using plans. Development management, making decisions on planning applications. And enforcement, making sure development is carried out correctly and taking action when it's not. And there are also 4 strategic development planning authorities in Scotland covering each region. And sustainable development and implementation of legislation and national planning policy is the responsibility of these planning systems. The aim is for a planning service that is efficient, inclusive, fit for purpose, and takes into account environmental sustainability. The planning system has a key role in delivering high quality places for Scotland. It tries to balance competing demands to make sure that land is used and developed in the public's long-term interest. And that primary responsibility for the planning service in Scotland lies with the 32 planning authorities and 2 national parks, the Cairngorms and Loch Lomond and Trossachs. They also have to collaborate with Scottish agencies like Scottish Water, Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, SEPA, Scottish Natural Heritage, Transport Scotland, and Historic Environment Scotland. So they have a duty to engage in the development plan process at different stages. So a lot of collaboration here, and it'll be interesting to see how your remote rural or remote accessible regions, how they incorporate this interplay between all these local authorities and these environmental agencies and transport agencies, etc. And it's helpful to look at the EU Rural Development Program and to see examples of projects funded by the EAFRD, I love that acronym, and implemented through regional development plans, or rural development plans. So for example, providing investment funds for a small family pepper growing business in Hungary using exclusively renewable energy, setting up a house location system in Formentera, Spain, that has helped emergency services to respond quickly to people in need, restoring the damaged forests in Slovakia through the funding, the clearing, afforestation, and preservation of young forest stands. So it's possible that you may find examples like this for your remote rural or accessible rural location. So these are the bottom-up policies that could be connected to your region. And by bottom up, we mean that there's a great deal of autonomy at the local level with local development groups and citizens of the area to create policy, to form it, and not be beholden to many constraints from in a hierarchical system in which orders come from the top. So they are free to more or less, once they have the grant, to decide how to create their vision of what is sustainable development in their area. We have a number of bottom-up policies, and they may or may not all apply to your rural area. I'm going to focus a lot on the LEADER initiative because it's been around for a long time and because it is one of the most widely known and commonly used bottom-up approach. Its acronym is French, and so it doesn't have a kind of, every letter means a certain word phrase, but ultimately kind of translates as links between activities for the development of the rural economy. The idea was to engage the energy and the resources of people and local organizations as development actors rather than beneficiaries. So it really wants to cut people loose to form the vision that they've kind of crafted within their community development organizations. And the LEADER method is based on 7 specific features, and it's dependent on all of those being present and employed together. And so in that way, it's a kind of methodology, and it separates it from being simply a funding program. The first one, the bottom-up approach, is at the heart of LEADER. And so the ethos of LEADER conceives that local people are the best experts to drive the development of their territory. And that bottom-up approach means that the local community and local players can help define a development pathway for their area consistent with their needs, expectations, and plans. Number 2, the area forms the basis for the development of the local partnership and strategy, creating a positive vision for what could be backed up by an active alliance of local stakeholders. So under the area-based approach, the program funding targets the priorities of the area as a whole, not specific projects or groups of projects. So it is very distinct from a project-based approach. And the number 3, the local partnerships for area development work through a specific and structured governance mechanism. And in LEADER, this is referred to as the local action group, or LAG. Number 4, LEADER tries to build the links between the rural economy and development actions. So partnerships and their local development strategies aim to capitalize on the link between local sectors to exploit the potential multiplier effects. And number 5, networking brings those involved together in disseminating and sharing knowledge, their experience, innovations, ideas, and information, developing peer support, overcoming isolation, and building capacity. Number 6, innovation. They try to seek out and foster new and innovative solutions to local problems or take advantages of opportunities. And in this case, it applies to not only new products or services, but also how things are done. So if it can be streamlined to be more efficient and less bureaucratic, then that is a leading hallmark of LEADER programs. And number 7, cooperation. So interterritorial and international cooperation adds a wider development dimension to local projects in rural areas. So not just local action groups and local people, but trying to build alliances through EU programs and member states and beyond the EU for a really international and focused scope. So remember, this is a methodology for the LEADER initiative, and to have all of these omnipresent is is what LEADER looks for to provide funding. And yeah. The Rural Skills Plan may be something that applies to your area. The Skills Action Plan for rural Scotland tries to address skill shortages, talent retention, and attraction and demographic challenges. Remember, we talked about an aging population, the lack of youth in rural areas, and it also tries to enhance work-based learning, so more continued professional development in the workforce, and places a lot of access to education and skills provision to upscale workers, so to get them accessible training and education. So its priority actions include taking a collaborative approach to delivering skills, providing accessible education and skills, and upskilling of the current rural workforce. So the Crofting Communities Grant Scheme provides grants for crofters to make improvements to their crofts and help to sustain their businesses. So funding can be used for capital projects like the construction or improvement of agricultural buildings, the establishment of common grazing committees who are responsible for managing and maintaining common grazing, and it's elected by crofters who use it. And total amount that you can get in any 2-year period for an individual is up to $25,000, or a group of crofters up to $125,000. Farmers markets have been identified as potential keys in unlocking a lot of rural development in sustainable ways. They employ hundreds, if not, once you go through all the supply chains and different producers and wholesalers, hundreds, if not thousands of people, and they many millions in turnover, and this is despite having just a very low market share of the total food market. They provide jobs, improve the public understanding of food, improve access to local healthy food, lots of education for children, training apprentices, community regeneration, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also enhance biodiversity. And on average, businesses have at least a few different routes to market, like box schemes, farmers market, supplying restaurants, and over 60% of businesses in a recent report were interested in cooperating to grow the local food sector. So there's a lot of interest in sustainable food hubs and grants and policies surrounding ways to get farmers, especially those under the age of 40, onto the land, but also to support the development of these kinds of businesses. So the Rural Community Transport Initiative was successful in helping to provide assistance to community and voluntary groups, especially helpful in the remote rural areas for the elderly. And a lot of projects included community minibuses, transport coordination, dial-a-bus and car schemes. Now we have a lot of the private sector moving in the form of Uber drivers and other car share riding schemes, but a lack of workers can sometimes be present, as we've seen before in these areas. And so they can be these services can be really helpful in the remote areas of Scotland, particularly where there are no scheduled bus services or where services are very limited. So community planning partnerships are responsible for 2 types of plans to describe their local priorities and planned improvements. Local outcome improvement plans, which cover the whole council area, and then locality plans, which cover smaller areas within the CPP area. So it'll be a good idea to see which of these apply to your region. And we know that there are 32 community planning partnerships across Scotland, 1 for each council area. each CPP focuses on where partners' collective efforts and resources can give the most value to their local communities, and they especially try to focus on reducing inequality in an area. With community land ownership, the most recent clause came into force in April 2020, which was focused on sustainable development, and it allows compliant community groups the opportunity to apply for the right to buy land to further sustainable development, including salmon fishing, restoring those stocks, and then also mineral rights. The community right to buy allows communities in Scotland to apply to register an interest in the land and the opportunity to buy that land when it comes up for sale. So development trusts are community-owned and led organizations that work to combine community-led action to address and tackle local needs and issues. And they try to create social, economic, and environmental renewal in a defined area and create local wealth and in that area and keep it there. And they give a lot of information, advice, support, and do effective facilitation of workshops and partnerships for community organizations and local people from rural area. And the Scottish Rural Network encourages rural development by sharing information, ideas, and good practice. They have a number of case studies showing their approach and the results, and the information to connect and inspire with a number of success stories, complete with funding and advice for every step of the way, because oftentimes these have a kind of a forming aspect of the project, and then what's called a storming approach is when things go wrong and things don't go according to plan, and the community has strife within itself. And we have seen this happen, and if they can get through that phase and normalize relations again, then they can perform and have a somewhat modified but still working plan that builds on their original aspirations for sustainable development or crofting or farmers market or sustainable tourism. So there's a lot to be said about the process of these and not just the policies and the outcomes. Okay, so for this week, you'll be tasked with submitting to the discussion board the final part of Outcome 1. That was covered in last week's presentation, which was to describe the situation in the areas in terms of key indicators of economic development with specific reference to income, employment, land use, and businesses, and then comment on any trends that are apparent. If you finish that and you've wrapped up Outcome 1, you're ready to submit, then go ahead and get started this week on Outcome 2. For this week, there will be a general discussion board if you're still having questions related to Outcome 1. So with that in mind, just here's a list of things to think about for Outcome 2. And okay, that's it. See you next time.